The snow that swallowed everything and yet gave life back. Imagine a world where mountains are not just tall, but merciless, where snow is not a soft blanket, but a cold blade, where silence is not peaceful, but threatening, where nature is not a companion, but an adversary. This is the Andes, one of the most unforgiving mountain ranges on Earth, a place where the wind howls like an ancient creature searching for its path, where snow falls as if the heavens themselves had turned away, where the mountains do not simply stand, they judge. In October 1972, an aircraft cut across this brutal landscape. On board was a Uruguayan rugby team, friends, family members, young men filled with life, plans, and laughter. Boys who had no idea how quickly the world can change, how laughter can turn into screams, how hope can turn into despair, how life can turn into a battle. Their destination was Chile, but the mountains had other plans. Among the passengers was a young man named Nando Parrado, a boy who loved speed, sport, and freedom, a boy who believed his whole life was ahead of him. He had no idea that he was about to face a struggle so immense that every pain he had ever known would pale beside it. The crash, when the world split apart. The aircraft was flying over the mountains when sudden turbulence shook it violently. The pilots believed they had already passed the highest peaks. They were wrong. The plane struck the side of a mountain. A wing tore off. The fuselage split in two. The aircraft's remains tumbled across the snow like a shredded toy. The silence that followed was not human, not natural. It felt as if the mountain itself were listening, as if it were asking, who survived, and for how long? The survivors slowly regained consciousness. Many had died on impact. Others were gravely injured, and the cold attacked immediately. Nando was unconscious for days. When he finally woke, the world was white and silent. The snow swallowed every sound. The cold froze every thought. The survivors huddled inside the broken fuselage. It became their home, their shelter, their coffin, unless they found a way out. Those who stayed behind, between hope and fear. The fuselage was a freezing cave by day, a deadly tomb by night. Wind echoed through the torn metal like whispers from another world. Among the survivors were Roberto Francois, who carved the daily head count into a piece of metal; Fito Strauch, who crafted tools from wreckage to melt snow for water; Eduardo Strauch, who watched over the others in quiet determination; Roy Harley, who tried every single day to repair the radio, hoping, just once, it might speak; Carlitos Paez, one of the youngest, who said every night, I believe they'll come back. And there were those who slowly lost hope, not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly, speaking less, eating less, avoiding eye contact. The mountain did not only attack the body, it attacked the soul. Hunger, the decision no one wants to make. Hunger is not a simple feeling. In the mountains, hunger is a predator. It creeps into your thoughts, steals your strength, clouds your mind, and leaves only one question behind. What are you willing to do to stay alive? The survivors knew there was no food, no plants in the snow, no animals, nothing, except the bodies of their dead friends. The decision was not quick, not easy, not natural. Many prayed for days, begging God for another way. But there was no other way. Eventually, they said, if they were alive, they would do the same for us. It was not barbaric. It was not cruel. It was survival. And it required a kind of strength only those who have stood face to face with death can understand. The avalanche, when the mountain attacked again. Then, one night, the mountain moved. Snow thundered down,
burying the fuselage, killing several survivors instantly. The others clawed their way upward in the darkness, their hands numb, their lungs burning, the air running out. Panic rose. Death sat beside them. When they finally broke through to the surface, the world was silent again. But something had changed. They understood. If no one left to find help, they would all die. And that was the moment when Nando stood up.
The decision, when a human steps out of death's shadow. The survivors gathered around him. The air inside the fuselage was thin, the light dim, the hope fragile. "We have to go," Nando said. His voice was quiet but steady. Canessa nodded. He had believed from the beginning that beyond the mountains lay life, civilization, salvation. The others watched silently. Some prayed, some cried, some whispered, "Go, we'll wait for you. Don't die." Nando and Canessa packed what little they had: blankets, scraps of food, a piece of metal for signaling, and the belief that something existed beyond the endless white. The others watched them step into the snow. The fuselage behind them shrank into the distance. The cold bit into their skin. The wind cut their faces like shards of glass. But they walked. Day 1. Leaving the illusion of safety. Behind them, the fuselage looked small, fragile, almost unreal. Ahead of them stretched the world of white, a world that did not care whether they lived or died. They walked until their legs trembled, until their breath burned, until the cold seeped into their bones. But they did not stop. Day 2. The mountain's first test. The snow deepened, the wind strengthened, the cold grew sharper. Canessa faltered. His lips turned blue, his voice cracked. "I can't go on." Nando looked at him. There was no anger in his eyes, only determination. "Yes, you can. One more step, just one, then another." And they continued. Day 3. The shadow of death. The third day brought a storm. Snow swallowed the sky. Wind screamed through the peaks. The cold stabbed their skin like needles. Every breath hurt. Canessa collapsed more than once. Nando lifted him every time. "I won't leave you. We started together. We finish together." The mountains watched them in silence, as if deciding whether they deserved to live. Day 4. The silence that speaks. On the fourth day, the mountains fell silent. No wind, no storm, just an endless, blinding white. The silence felt as if the world were holding its breath. Canessa looked at Nando and asked, his voice thin and tired, "Do you think this still makes sense?" Nando didn't answer immediately. He stared at the horizon, a horizon that never seemed to come closer. Then he said quietly, "As long as we breathe, it makes sense." In the Andes, that wasn't poetry. It was survival. Back at the fuselage, the slow erosion of hope. While Nando and Canessa fought their way through the mountains, the survivors in the fuselage lived through their own kind of torment. Every night, the temperature dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. The darkness pressed against the torn metal walls like a living thing. They huddled together for warmth, their breath forming tiny clouds in the freezing air. They prayed the rosary every evening. There was no priest, no church, only snow, darkness, and the fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, the two boys would return. But every night, the same question hung in the air. What if they don't come back? And they prepared for that possibility. Some said, if they fail, we'll go. Weak, starving, freezing, but we'll go. Staying in the fuselage didn't mean safety. It only meant a slower death.
Day 5. When the body wants to quit, but the soul refuses. On the 5th day, the mountains felt alive. The wind sometimes howled like a voice calling their names. The snow sometimes cracked under their feet as if something deep beneath the surface were shifting. Canessa was fading. His legs trembled. His breath came in ragged gasps. Dark circles hollowed his eyes. Nando, I can't go on. His voice was barely a whisper. Nando stopped. He looked at his friend, really looked at him. There was no fear in his eyes, no doubt, only that stubborn, unbreakable determination that had been burning in him since the moment he woke after the crash. Yes, you can, because we must, because there's no other way, because 15 people are waiting behind us, and if we give up, they die. Canessa closed his eyes, then nodded, and they walked on.
Day 6. The first hint of life beyond the mountains. On the 6th day, something changed. The air felt warmer. The snow thinned. Dark patches of rock appeared beneath their feet. The wind carried a different scent, not the sterile cold of the high peaks, but something softer, something alive. Do you feel that? Nando asked. This isn't mountain air. Canessa nodded. For the first time in days, a spark lit in his eyes. Hope. Beyond the mountains, there was a world with people, with warmth, with life, and they were getting closer. Day 7. The wall between life and death. On the 7th day, they reached a cliff, a sheer, towering wall of ice and rock that seemed to pierce the sky. Canessa stared at it in disbelief. We can't climb that. Nando didn't hesitate. Yes, we can, because we have to. And they climbed, with numb fingers, with bleeding hands, with feet that slipped on ice, with bodies that screamed for rest. They clawed their way upward, inch by inch, breath by breath. When they reached the top, they stood in silence. Behind them lay a world of white. Before them, brown earth, green valleys, the first signs of life. They had crossed the spine of the Andes. Back at the fuselage, the last threads of faith. Meanwhile, the survivors in the fuselage felt time stretching like an endless night. Some prayed, some whispered to the dead. Some stared into the darkness, trying to imagine what Nando and Canessa were seeing. Roy Harley still worked on the radio every day, even though he knew it was hopeless. But hope is not logical. Hope is stubborn. Carlitos Paez, the youngest, said every night, "They're alive. I know they are." And somehow that belief, that thin, fragile thread, kept them alive too. Day 8. The edge of the world. On the 8th day, the white world finally broke open. Brown earth, green patches, a valley stretching into the distance. Nando stopped, his breath caught in his throat. "We're close," he said. Canessa nodded, too tired to speak, but his eyes shining with something fierce and bright. They were no longer walking toward hope. They were walking inside it. Day 9. The final exhaustion. On the 9th day, their bodies were nearly done. Their lips cracked, their voices hoarse, their legs trembling with every step. But they kept going, because behind them 15 souls waited. 15 lives depended on their footsteps. Responsibility can be heavier than hunger, heavier than cold, heavier than fear, and that weight carried them forward. Day 10. The moment before the miracle. On the 10th day, a dark shape appeared on the horizon, a moving shape, a human shape. In a place where only snow and silence had existed for days, a human voice echoed across the valley. A shepherd, a man, a miracle.
The shepherd stared at them, unable to believe what he was seeing. Two skeletal figures wrapped in rags, their faces blue with cold, their bodies shaking. Nando shouted with the last of his strength, "Somos sobrevivientes!" We are survivors. The shepherd turned pale. Then he ran for help. Back at the fuselage, Faith hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, the survivors in the fuselage felt time stretching like an endless night. Some prayed, some whispered to the dead. Some stared into the darkness, trying to imagine what Nando and Canessa were seeing. The cold gnawed at their bones, the hunger hollowed their faces, the silence pressed against their minds. But every evening, Carlitos Paez whispered, "They're coming back. I know they are." And somehow that whisper kept the darkness from swallowing them whole. The miracle, when the mountain finally spoke. The shepherd ran, his boots slammed against the frozen ground, his breath tearing from his lungs in sharp bursts. It wasn't every day that a man saw two skeletal figures emerge from the belly of the Andes. When he reached the village, he shouted for help. His voice shook, not from fear, but from the realization that something impossible had happened. At first, the villagers didn't believe him. Then they saw the two figures in the distance, moving slowly, uncertainly, like ghosts returning from another world. Nando and Canessa looked as if they had been carved from the mountain itself. Their clothes hung in tatters. Their skin was blue with cold. Their eyes were sunken, but burning with something unmistakable. Life. The villagers rushed toward them. They lifted them up, wrapped them in blankets, gave them water, food, warmth. And then came the question that froze everyone in place. How many are still up there? Nando's voice trembled as he answered, 15. The villagers stared at him in shock. 15 souls, 15 lives, 15 people trapped in the jaws of the Andes. And that was the moment the second half of the miracle began, the rescue. When the world finally moved. The news spread like wildfire. From the village to the nearby towns, to the radio stations, to the entire country. There are survivors in the Andes. 16 young men are alive. A rugby team has returned from the dead. The authorities didn't believe it at first. Then they saw Nando and Canessa, and disbelief turned into urgency. Helicopters were summoned, rescue teams assembled, mountain guides prepared, doctors rushed to the scene. The engines roared across the sky, not carrying passengers toward death, but carrying life toward the mountains. The pilots knew the risks. The air was thin, the winds unpredictable, the terrain unforgiving. But they went, because 15 people were waiting. Back at the fuselage, when hope returned. The survivors sat inside the fuselage, their bodies weak, their spirits frayed, their hope flickering like a dying flame. But something felt different. The wind carried a new sound, a new vibration, a new promise. And then they heard it, the thundering beat of helicopter blades. At first it was only a distant hum, then it grew louder, then it filled the valley, then it was right above them. The survivors stumbled out into the snow. They waved, they shouted, they cried, they laughed. The helicopter landed. The rescuers stepped out, and something extraordinary happened. The survivors didn't rush forward. They stood still, staring, disbelieving, overwhelmed. Someone whispered, "They did it. They came back for us." The rescuers cried. The survivors cried. The mountains stood silent, and for a moment the world held its breath. The families, when hope took human form. The news traveled faster than the wind, faster than fear, faster than grief. They found them. They're alive. 16 survived. At first, the families didn't believe it. Then they saw the names, then the photographs, then the faces of their sons. Mothers wept. Fathers fell to their knees. Siblings embraced. Friends prayed. And somewhere in the background, quiet and still, stood a man who had never stopped believing. Paes Villaró, the father they had called the madman, the father who refused to accept death, the father who searched when everyone else had given up, the father who said, "My son is alive, I know it, I feel it." When he saw his son's name on the list of survivors, he didn't shout, he didn't collapse, he didn't scream. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." The return, when the mountain gave back what it took. The helicopters lifted off one by one. The survivors climbed aboard, their bodies frail, their spirits blazing. As the last helicopter rose into the air, the mountains stretched beneath them, silent, vast, eternal. Not as enemies, not as executioners, but as witnesses. Witnesses to the fact that the human spirit can endure what the body cannot. Witnesses to the miracle that had unfolded in their frozen heart. Epilogue. Life after the mountain. The survivors met often in the years that followed, not to relive the horror, but to honor the bond that had been forged in the cold. Nando Parado became a speaker, sharing the lessons the mountain had carved into him. "The Andes taught me that life isn't about how much time you have," he said. "It's about what you do with it." Roberto Canessa became a doctor. He said, "The mountain taught me that every life has value." Carlitos Paez said, "The mountain taught me to believe in myself, in others, in miracles." And all of them knew the mountain had not been an enemy, not a punishment, not a curse. The mountain had been a teacher, harsh, unforgiving, but true. And even today, if you listen closely, the Andes still whisper, "Hope is sometimes just a snowflake, but if you don't let it go, it will eventually show you the way."